The beam from the phone's flashlight cut a trembling circle through the profound, suffocating darkness, illuminating a small chamber 100 feet inside the earth. The air was cold, thick with the scent of damp stone and the ghostly memory of coal dust that seemed to cling to every surface. 11-year-old Tyler Miller held the light steady, his other hand clutching the frail, wrinkled fingers of his grandmother Betty, who sat quietly on a dusty mattress someone had left here decades ago. His light swept past a makeshift table crafted from old crates and across walls etched with the faint marks of forgotten calendars. It was then that the beam caught the dull glint of metal under the mattress. He knelt, his knees pressing into the cold ground, and pulled out a rusted lockbox. The latch, weakened by time and moisture, gave way with a soft groan. Inside, nestled against the corroded metal, was a diary, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. As he opened the cover and his light fell upon the first entry, dated 1984, a tremor went through him, a deep, resonant understanding that he and his grandmother were not the first souls to seek sanctuary in this tomb, and that the story he had just unearthed would change the course of his own. This single moment, buried deep within the heart of a forgotten mountain, was the fulcrum upon which Tyler's entire future would pivot. If you already feel a connection to this story of a young boy's desperate love and the incredible discovery he made in the dark, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. We love hearing from our community, so take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. Your support allows us to continue bringing powerful stories like this to light, reminding us that even in the most hopeless of circumstances, a connection to the past can illuminate a path forward. This is a journey worth seeing through to the very end, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit against overwhelming odds, and we are grateful to share it with you. But to understand the true weight of that discovery, to comprehend the sheer desperation that would drive an 11-year-old boy to lead his ailing grandmother into the condemned blackness of the Sullivan coal mine, we cannot begin here. This moment of quiet revelation was not a beginning, but a fragile port in a storm that had been brewing for years and had finally broken just 6 hours earlier. The roots of this impossible choice were planted in the thin, worn-out carpet of a run-down trailer at the edge of town, with a sharp, unwelcome knock on a flimsy door. To truly know why Tyler chose a condemned mine over a warm bed, we must return to that Saturday morning, to the very moment his world, the small, fragile world he had fought so hard to protect, began to shatter completely. 11-year-old Tyler Miller was a ghost in his own life, a silent sentinel in a world that had shrunk to the dimensions of a rusting, single-wide trailer on the forgotten edge of Coal Ridge, West Virginia. His existence was measured not in school days or summer vacations, but in the quiet, rhythmic cycle of care he provided for his grandmother, Betty. The air inside the trailer was a permanent archive of their lives, a mixture of stale coffee, dust, and the faint medicinal scent of his grandmother's pills. He had learned to navigate the cramped space with an economy of movement, his small frame weaving between stacks of old newspapers and furniture, worn thin by time and poverty. His world was a fortress, built of necessity, and he was its soul. Weary guardian, a boy forced to carry the weight of an adult's responsibilities on shoulders that were still learning how to grow into the world. His days were a carefully constructed routine, a series of small, vital tasks that kept their fragile existence from collapsing. He would wake before the sun, his first action always to check that the burners on the old gas stove were off. He'd learned that lesson the hard way one terrifying night. Then came breakfast, usually oatmeal, which he would prepare and then patiently spoon-feed to Betty if her hands were trembling too much that morning. He managed their meager finances, the $750 from her monthly Social Security check, with the meticulousness of a seasoned accountant, stretching every dollar to cover rent, utilities, and food. He was the one who remembered which pills she needed at which time, laying them out in a small, chipped saucer, a silent offering to the fog that was steadily claiming her mind. The life he had before this one was a distant, fragmented memory. He was 7 when his parents died, their lives extinguished in the violent, chemical flash of a methamphetamine lab explosion that had made the local news for a week, and then faded into the town's long history of tragedies. He didn't remember their faces clearly, only the hollow silence that descended upon the house afterward. His paternal grandmother, Betty, had taken him in without a moment's hesitation, her arms a warm refuge from the cold, confusing world of social workers and whispered condolences. For a few years she was his anchor, a source of stories and warm meals. But now the roles had reversed completely. He was the anchor, and she was the one drifting further and further out to a sea of confusion he could not navigate. The decline had been gradual at first, a series of small, forgivable lapses. Misplaced keys, forgotten names, a story repeated 3 times in an hour. But in the last 6 months the forgetfulness had sharpened into something dangerous. He'd come home from his rare walks in the woods to find the front door wide open, his grandmother nowhere in sight, only to find her standing in the middle of the road, staring at the passing cars with a look of profound bewilderment. Twice, he had woken to the acrid smell of burning plastic because she'd placed a container on a hot stove. Each incident etched a new line of worry onto his young face, tightening the knot of fear in his stomach that he was failing her, that he couldn't protect her from herself. Sleep offered little respite. He had become a light sleeper, his ears attuned to the specific frequency of her nighttime wanderings. The creak of her bedroom door was an alarm that could pull him from the deepest dream. More nights than he could count, he would find her in the small living room, her hands pressed against the window, talking to a reflection she no longer recognized. He would not startle her. Instead, he would gently take her hand, his voice a low, soothing murmur, and guide her back to the safety of her bed. He would sit by her side until her breathing evened out, the moon through the thin curtains illuminating the exhaustion on his own face, before he would creep back to his own room for another hour or 2 of fractured rest. He was profoundly alone in this struggle. The neighbors, like Mrs. Patterson next door, were kind enough, offering a wave or a plate of cookies on holidays, but they saw only what was on the surface, a quiet boy and his elderly grandmother. They didn't see the nights spent awake, the constant vigilance, the burden of a love so fierce it felt like it might break him. He kept the true state of their lives hidden, a secret guarded with a ferocity born of terror. He knew, with the primal instinct of a child protecting his home, that if the outside world saw the full extent of Betty's decline, they would intervene. They would call it help, but he knew it would be an ending. Sometimes, through the thin walls of the trailer, he could hear the sounds of other children playing in the street, their laughter a bright, sharp sound from another universe. He didn't feel jealousy, not anymore. That emotion had long since been worn down into a dull, aching sense of otherness. Their world of scraped knees, video games, and arguments over whose turn it was to bat was as foreign to him as a distant planet. His reality was the weight of his grandmother's hand in his, the texture of her wrinkled skin, the challenge of coaxing her to eat one more spoonful, and the quiet victory of getting through another day without disaster. There were still moments, however fleeting, that made it all bearable. Rare, precious flashes of lucidity when the fog in Betty's eyes would clear, and for a minute she would be there again. Just last week, as he was brushing her hair, she had looked at their reflection in the small, cracked mirror on her dresser. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. She had smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and whispered his name. Not just his name, but a full thought. "You have your mother's eyes, Tyler," she had said, her voice clear and strong. The moment was gone as quickly as it came, but he held onto it, a tiny, glowing coal in the cold darkness of his life. This love was the entire foundation of his world. It was a fierce, protective, and desperate love for the woman who had saved him when he had no one else. He was repaying that debt with every ounce of his being, shielding her from a world he was certain would not understand. His greatest fear wasn't her illness itself, but the sterile, impersonal care that strangers would provide. He pictured her in a white room, surrounded by people who didn't know her stories, who didn't understand the specific cadence of her hums when she was happy. He imagined himself in a house with a different family, a foster kid with a past no one wanted to talk about. The thought of them being separated was not just a fear, it was an impossibility, a tear in the fabric of his universe that he would not allow. He had built their world to withstand the slow internal erosion of her disease. He had become a master of their small kingdom, anticipating every need, deflecting every danger from within. He had become so focused on the enemy inside their walls that he had forgotten to watch for the threat that would come from the outside. He didn't know that his careful secret world was about to be breached, and that the greatest danger would not arrive with a storm or a sickness, but with a simple, polite knock on their flimsy trailer door. That Saturday morning, the fragile peace of their small world was shattered by a sound it was never meant to hear. It wasn't the rumble of a passing coal truck or the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. It was a sharp, authoritative knock on the flimsy aluminum door. The sound was so out of place, so clean and decisive, that it made Tyler freeze, a half-eaten piece of toast halfway to his mouth. A knot of pure, cold dread instantly formed in his stomach. No one ever knocked like that. Friends of his grandmother, back when she had them, would call out her name from the porch. Delivery drivers would just leave packages. This was the knock of someone who didn't belong, someone who had come with a purpose. He set the toast down, his appetite gone, and crept to the window, pulling back the thin, yellowed curtain just enough to see who had breached their sanctuary. His heart sank. Standing on their rickety wooden steps was Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor, but her presence offered no comfort. Her face was etched with a kind of nervous pity that made Tyler's skin crawl. Beside her stood another woman, a stranger with tired eyes and a resolute set to her mouth that spoke of difficult conversations and unchangeable decisions. She wore a simple blouse and slacks and held a worn leather briefcase in one hand. She was not a friend, not a relative, not anyone who belonged in their quiet, forgotten corner of the world. Everything about her, from her sensible shoes to her determined posture, screamed official business. She was the outside world, an emissary from the system he had spent years trying to avoid, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she had come for them. He opened the door a few inches, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Mrs. Patterson offered a weak, apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tyler, honey," she began, her voice wavering. "This is Miss Jenkins. She's here to talk." The stranger stepped forward slightly, her gaze direct but not unkind. "My name is Susan Jenkins," she said, her voice calm and professional. "I'm with Logan County Child Protective Services." The full name of the agency landed in the cramped space of the trailer like a physical blow, sucking all the oxygen from the air. Tyler felt a dizzying wave of panic. This was it, the moment he had dreaded every single day. He stepped back, his movements stiff and robotic, and let them inside, the sense of a terrible, unstoppable force already settling over him like a shroud. Once inside, Miss Jenkins's eyes moved around the small living room. It wasn't a judgmental scan, but something worse, a professional assessment. Her gaze took in the stacks of old newspapers, the threadbare armchair where Betty sat, the faint but persistent smell of medication that hung in the air. She glanced at his grandmother, who was humming softly to herself, seemingly unaware of the intrusion, lost in a gentle fog. Tyler felt a hot flush of shame and anger. His home, his sanctuary, was being catalogued as a collection of risk factors, every detail that constituted their life. The worn carpet, the chipped saucer with Betty's pills, the very air they breathed, was being entered as evidence against him, confirming a story someone else had told about them, a story he was now powerless to refute. Miss Jenkins sat on the edge of their worn sofa, placing her briefcase beside her. She didn't waste time with small talk. Her tone was measured, practiced, designed to convey authority without cruelty. "Tyler," she began, looking directly at him, "we've received several calls from concerned neighbors. They're worried about your grandmother's safety and about you." She explained that based on the reports and on what she could see, it was clear that Betty's dementia had progressed to a point where she needed constant, professional medical supervision. She used phrases like a safe and secure environment and specialized memory care, but all Tyler heard was that they were going to take his grandmother away and lock her in a sterile white room filled with strangers, a place where her stories would die and her memories would have no anchor. Then she turned her attention fully to him, and the second hammer fell. "Because you are only 11, she continued, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its finality. "You cannot legally be her caregiver. The state has a responsibility to ensure you are also in a safe and appropriate home." She said the words foster care system as if they were a solution, a safety net. To Tyler, they were a death sentence for his identity. He saw a future of moving between strange houses, of being the quiet, sad boy with the tragic past, of losing his name, his history, and the only human connection that gave his life meaning. The separation was not presented as a possibility to be discussed, but as a foregone conclusion, a series of procedural steps that were already in motion. The final, crushing detail came with an air of administrative finality. Miss Jenkins explained that she understood this was a shock and that these things take time. But the process had to begin immediately for safety reasons. She stood up, her part of the conversation finished. "I won't overwhelm you with paperwork today," and she said, as if it were a kindness. "I will be back on Monday morning. We'll sign the initial documents then and start arranging the placements." Monday. The word was a gunshot in the silent room. It was Saturday. A frantic, desperate calculation spun in his head. Less than 48 hours. The vague, terrifying threat that had haunted his nightmares now had a name, a face, and a deadline. The end of his world was scheduled for Monday morning. As the two women moved toward the door, Mrs. Patterson gave him another look of profound pity, an expression that felt like being buried alive. Miss Jenkins offered a final, detached piece of professional comfort. "I know this is hard to understand right now, Tyler," she said, her hand on the doorknob, "but in the long run this is what's best for both of you." The door clicked shut behind them, and the silence they left behind was a physical weight, heavier and more suffocating than the trailer had ever felt. The knock had been the sound of an invasion, and their quiet departure was the confirmation that his world had been conquered. He was alone, with a ticking clock and a choice that no child should ever have to make. He stood frozen in the middle of the room for a full minute, the woman's words replaying in his mind. He looked over at his grandmother. She had finally noticed him, and a brief, lucid smile touched her lips. "There you are," she said, as if he'd just returned from a long journey. The simple, loving words broke through his paralysis and solidified into a single, unshakable resolve. The system saw a problem to be solved with paperwork and institutions. They saw a sick old woman and a child in an untenable situation. They didn't see the love. They didn't see the promise he had made to himself, the unspoken vow to protect the woman who had saved him. They saw a case file. He saw his entire world. And in that crushing, definitive silence, he knew he would not let them take it from him without a fight. The silence that followed the click of the closing door was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating blanket that settled over the small trailer. Tyler stood motionless, his feet seemingly rooted to the worn linoleum, the social worker's final words echoing in the sudden void. "Best for both of you." The phrase was a lie, a neat, tidy label for an act of profound violence. He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon his grandmother. Betty had finally looked up from her hands, a flicker of awareness in her clouded eyes. She saw him standing there, his small frame rigid with a tension she could not comprehend, and a gentle, untroubled smile spread across her face. "There you are," she said, her voice soft and familiar, as if he had just returned from school. That simple, loving greeting, offered from a mind adrift in its own sea, was the spark that ignited the cold dread in his stomach into a blaze of pure, unshakable resolve. In that instant, the decision was made. It wasn't a thought or a calculation. It was a physical certainty that tightened every muscle in his body. They would not be broken. He would not allow it. His mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic and helplessness just moments before, suddenly became sharp and clear, honed to a single point of purpose. The overwhelming sense of impending doom was replaced by a cold, methodical focus. The world had just handed him a deadline, Monday morning. The ticking of the cheap plastic clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, each second a hammer blow counting down the final hours of their life together. He looked around the trailer, but he no longer saw a home. He saw a temporary base of operations. The threadbare armchair was a potential obstacle. The pantry was an arsenal of meager supplies. The back door was an escape route. His fear did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing fog, but a fuel, a high-octane energy propelling him toward an unknown horizon. He was no longer a victim waiting for the inevitable. He was a strategist, a fugitive planning his first move in a war he had no choice but to fight. The immediate question was not if they would run, but where. His mind raced through a desolate landscape of possibilities, finding every path blocked. They had no car, no money for a bus ticket, and no family left to run to. The world outside their small town was a vast, indifferent wilderness he had no means of navigating. Then, an image surfaced from the depths of his memory, a place both feared and fascinating. The Sullivan coal mine. He had explored its periphery with other boys years ago, daring each other to step into the gaping, timber-framed maw that locals called a tomb. He remembered the profound chill that emanated from its blackness, the feeling of standing at the edge of a forgotten world. The very things that made it terrifying to a child now made it a perfect sanctuary for a fugitive. It was close enough to reach on foot, yet remote enough to be invisible. No one would ever think to look for them there. The idea was born of pure desperation, a wild, illogical leap that felt, in that moment, like the only sane choice he had. He moved with a new kind of silence, a predator's grace in his own home. His first stop was the kitchen. He slid the pantry door open, its plastic runners groaning softly. The contents were a stark map of their poverty. A few cans, a box of crackers, the last dregs of a bag of sugar. He made his choices with ruthless efficiency, his hands steady. He took 2 cans of baked beans and a can of peaches, their weight feeling solid and reassuring in his grasp. He added a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers and a mostly full jar of peanut butter. He then went to the sink, the squeak of the faucet handle sounding like a gunshot in the quiet trailer. He carefully filled 4 empty soda bottles with water, screwing the caps on tight. He wrapped each item in a dish towel to prevent them from clattering together, a small, practical detail that made his insane plan feel more real, more manageable. He was not just running, he was preparing. The next task was the most critical, the one that underscored the life-or-death nature of his mission. He crept into Betty's small bedroom. The air was warm and smelled of her, a comforting scent that now felt like a farewell. On her nightstand sat the plastic pill organizer, its little compartments marked with the days of the week. He opened it carefully, his fingers meticulously counting out the small, colorful tablets she needed to keep the worst of her confusion at bay. He placed 1 week's worth into a small, sealable plastic bag, a fragile pharmacy that would be their lifeline in the dark. His eyes fell upon the thick, hand-knitted wool blanket folded at the foot of her bed. It was her favorite, a source of constant comfort. He knew they would need its warmth in the cold earth. Gently, so as not to wake her from her light nap, he eased it from the bed, his heart pounding with the finality of the act. He was stripping their home of its essentials, severing their ties one object at a time. He found his old-school backpack hanging on a hook inside his closet door. It was small, but it would have to be enough. He began to pack, arranging the items with the care of a soldier preparing his gear for battle. The food went in first, forming a solid base. The blanket was rolled tightly and stuffed on top. The bag of pills he placed in a small side pocket, where he could reach it easily. As he was zipping the main compartment, another thought struck him, a cold spike of practicality. Identity. He remembered his grandmother showing him a manila folder once, telling him it held their important papers. He found it tucked away in a kitchen drawer beneath a stack of old utility bills. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling slightly, as he saw their names on the birth certificates, the official stamps on their social security cards. This was the proof of their existence. He slid the folder into the backpack, a shield against becoming anonymous ghosts. He added his phone, its screen showing a full battery and the charging cable, though he had no idea when or where he might find electricity again. With the bag packed and leaning against the wall, a heavy, tangible symbol of his decision, he took a moment to walk through the trailer. Betty was still sleeping peacefully, her breath a soft, rhythmic whisper. This was a silent goodbye, not just to the place, but to the life they had lived within its thin walls. He ran his hand over the cracked vinyl of her favorite armchair, the place where she would sit for hours humming to herself. He paused in front of a small, dusty photograph on a side table. It was of the two of them at the county fair 3 years prior. In the photo she was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes clear and bright. He remembered the feeling of her hand in his that day, the taste of the cotton candy she'd bought him. That woman, the one in the photograph, was the one he was fighting for. The memory was not a source of sadness, but of strength, a clear image of the soul he was determined to protect from the sterile, impersonal world that was coming for them. He knew he had to leave a clue, but the right kind of clue. A total disappearance would trigger an immediate and frantic search. He needed to create a delay, to buy them time. He found a notepad by the phone, its pages filled with his own grocery lists and reminders. He tore off a clean sheet and, with a pencil, wrote a short, simple message. Gone to visit family for a few days. He tried to make his handwriting look like a child's, a little sloppy, a little rushed. The lie felt like a stone in his throat, a betrayal of the very neighbors who had, in their own way, tried to help. But their help was a cage, and he would use any tool he could to avoid it. He propped the note against the sugar bowl on the kitchen counter, a small, flimsy piece of deception that he prayed would be enough to give them a head start. Just as he finished, a sound from the bedroom told him Betty was stirring. He walked to her doorway and watched as she slowly sat up, blinking in the afternoon light, filtering through the grimy window. He was about to wake her to set their desperate plan in motion when a tidal wave of doubt crashed over him. The sheer monumental folly of his idea suddenly became terrifyingly clear. He was a boy. He was taking his frail, confused 71-year-old grandmother to live in a cold, dark, and dangerous hole in the ground. He pictured her stumbling in the darkness, pictured her getting sick, pictured 1,000 things that could go wrong. The rational, sensible voice of Miss Jenkins echoed in his mind, and for a heart-stopping moment, he considered surrender. It would be easier, it would be safer, it would be the end of everything he loved. He took a deep breath, pushing the crippling doubt down into the pit of his stomach. He would not fail her. He walked to her bedside and knelt down, forcing a brightness into his voice that he did not feel. "Grandma," he said softly, touching her arm, "wake up, I have a surprise for you." Her eyes, still clouded with the fog of sleep, slowly focused on his face. He had to make this sound like a game, a treat. "We're going on a special camping trip," he whispered, the lie feeling both enormous and necessary. "A secret adventure just for us, in a secret clubhouse in the mountains." To his immense relief, a flicker of interest, of childlike wonder, lit up her expression. Her complete and unwavering trust in him was a double-edged sword. It was the one thing that made this possible, and the one thing that made the burden of his choice almost unbearable. He helped her into her thickest sweater and a pair of sturdy walking shoes, his fingers fumbling with the laces. As he knelt before her, tying a double knot, the distant sound of children laughing and shouting drifted in through the open window. It was the sound of a normal Saturday afternoon, the sound of a world he was no longer a part of. That carefree noise was the final catalyst, a sharp reminder of the chasm that now separated him from everyone else. There was no more time for doubt, no more room for hesitation. Every second they lingered was a second closer to being discovered. He stood up, helped his grandmother to her feet, and slung the heavy backpack over his shoulders. He took her small, wrinkled hand in his. Her grip was weak, but it was there. Together they walked to the back door, took one last fleeting look at the only home they had ever known, and stepped out into the overgrown yard, turning their faces toward the dark, silent mountain that held their last and only hope. The journey began not with a sprint, but with a single, deliberate step off the cracked concrete of their back stoop and onto the damp, overgrown grass. The weight of the backpack was a shock, a dense physical manifestation of his decision that pulled at his shoulders and settled low on his spine. He held Betty's hand, her fingers feeling as delicate as a bird's wing in his grasp, and led her toward the back of the property line. The world he was leaving behind was a symphony of mundane Saturday sounds, the distant whine of a lawnmower, the faint shouts of children playing. each one a painful reminder of the normal life they were now fugitives from. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass from a neighbor's yard and the damp, earthy smell of the unkempt woods that loomed ahead, their destination and their only hope. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig under his worn sneakers, felt like an alarm bell announcing their escape to the entire world. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm for their desperate march. Their first true obstacle was not a mountain or a river, but a simple 5-foot-tall chain-link fence that marked the boundary between their small patch of the world and the wild, unmanaged forest beyond. It was old and rusted, the metal weeping orange streaks onto the weeds that grew thick around its base. For a moment, Tyler felt a surge of pure panic. The fence seemed impossibly high, a deliberate barrier erected by a world that wanted to keep them penned in. He scanned its length, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for a weakness. Betty stood patiently beside him, her expression one of mild curiosity, as if she were waiting for him to reveal the next part of their game. This trust, so absolute and so misplaced, was a spur that drove him past the initial wave of fear. He could not fail her here, not at the very first hurdle. He walked the fence line, his free hand tracing the rough, diamond-shaped pattern of the wire, his mind racing to find a solution before their luck ran out. He found it near an old oak tree where the ground had softened and eroded over the years, causing a section of the fence to sag, its top edge now barely reaching his chest. It was their only way through. He let go of Betty's hand for a moment, the separation feeling like a physical risk, and pushed against the weakened section. The metal groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to echo through the quiet afternoon, and he froze, listening for any sign that they had been heard. There was only silence. He pushed again, creating a small triangular opening near the bottom. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He demonstrated for Betty, showing her how to crouch low and slide through. Her movements were slow and uncertain, and as she passed through the opening, her thick wool sweater snagged on a twisted piece of wire, the sound of tearing fabric sharp and violent in the stillness. He gently freed her, his fingers fumbling, then scrambled through himself, the rough metal scraping against his backpack. They were through. They were in the woods. The transition was immediate and profound. The moment they were under the canopy of the trees, the world changed. The bright afternoon sun was instantly muted, filtered through a dense ceiling of green and gold leaves into a dappled, shifting twilight. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. The sounds of the neighborhood faded away, replaced by a new, more ancient soundscape. The whisper of wind through the branches, the chittering of a squirrel in the distance, the soft, steady crunch of their own footsteps on the forest floor. A powerful sense of concealment washed over Tyler, a feeling of having slipped through a crack in the world, into a place where the rules of men and their agencies no longer applied. He felt a flicker of something that was almost relief, the primal comfort of being hidden from view, even as a deeper, more profound fear of the unknown wilderness began to take root in his heart. He found the trail he was looking for, a path no wider than a whisper, forged by deer and forgotten by time. It was a faint indentation in the earth, a subtle parting of the ferns and undergrowth that only a boy who had spent his childhood exploring these same woods would recognize. The ground was treacherous, a tangled net of exposed roots and loose moss-covered stones that threatened to trip them with every step. He took the lead, his body angled forward against the weight of the pack, his head constantly turning to check on his grandmother. He held his arm out to steady her, pointing out the slick roots, his voice a low, constant murmur of encouragement. "Just a little further, Grandma. Watch your step here." He was no longer just her grandson or her caregiver, he was her guide, her protector, the sole navigator of their desperate exodus into the wild. After nearly an hour of slow, arduous progress, Betty's breathing became ragged, a shallow, whistling sound that sent a fresh spike of fear through Tyler. He knew he had to rest her, regardless of the risk. He found a wide, fallen log, its bark covered in a blanket of soft green moss, and gently helped her to sit. He unscrewed the cap from one of the water bottles, his hands shaking slightly from exertion, and held it to her lips. She drank in small, thirsty sips, her eyes closed. He watched her face, searching for any sign of pain or extreme distress. His own thirst, a distant, unimportant sensation. In the quiet of the forest, with his grandmother leaning heavily against him, the immense, terrifying fragility of his plan became starkly clear. He was a child, armed with nothing but a desperate love and a few cans of beans, trying to outrun an entire system. He felt a wave of doubt so powerful it almost buckled his knees. They were still resting when a new sound cut through the forest quiet, a sharp percussive barking that was too close for comfort. Tyler's blood ran cold. He scrambled to his feet, pulling Betty down behind the log with him. His hand clamped gently over her mouth to stifle any sound she might make. Through a gap in the ferns, he saw him, Mr. Henderson from 2 streets over, his bright orange hunting vest a jarring slash of color against the green, his beagle straining at its leash, not 50 yards away. The dog's nose was in the air, sniffing in their direction, its tail wagging furiously. A man's voice called out, "Come on, Buster, leave it!" For a heart-stopping eternity, the dog continued to pull toward their hiding spot. Tyler held his breath, his muscles coiled tight, certain they were about to be discovered. Then, with a final, frustrated yelp, the beagle gave up and trotted back to its owner. And the two of them continued down a different path, their voices fading into the trees. Tyler waited a full 5 minutes, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm in his ears, before he dared to move. The near discovery left Betty unsettled. As they started walking again, the fog of her confusion seemed to thicken. She began to pull at his hand, her steps faltering. "Tyler, where are we going?" she asked, her voice thin and laced with a new anxiety. "I want to go home. I don't like this game." The question was a dagger in his heart. He had to force a reassuring smile onto his face, to push a cheerful, confident tone into his voice that felt like a grotesque lie. "We're almost there, Grandma," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The secret clubhouse is just at the top of this hill. It has a soft bed and lots of good things to eat, remember? Our special adventure." He repeated the fabrication, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. But it was the only tool he had to keep her moving, to keep the fragile illusion of their game from shattering into the terrifying reality of their flight. The incline grew steeper, the path dissolving into a challenging scramble up the mountainside. The forest floor was a slick carpet of damp leaves, and Tyler had to use every bit of his strength to keep them both from sliding backward. He found himself bracing his body against trees, using one hand to grip the rough bark, while his other pulled his grandmother up behind him. He positioned himself on the downhill side of her, a small human shield against a fall that could end their journey in an instant. The burn in his calves was agonizing, and his lungs felt raw with every breath he dragged in. The physical world had narrowed to the next few feet of treacherous ground, the feel of Betty's weight leaning on him, and the singular all-consuming goal of putting one foot in front of the other, again and again, pulling them both higher into the mountain's embrace. It was on one of these steep sections that his greatest fear was nearly realized. Betty's foot slipped on a patch of wet moss, and with a small, startled cry, she began to fall. Tyler reacted on pure instinct, throwing his body backward to break her fall, the heavy backpack absorbing most of the impact. They tumbled together for a few feet, a chaotic tangle of limbs and fear, before coming to a stop against the base of a thick pine tree. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing, and the soft patter of dislodged dirt raining down on them. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He scrambled to her side, his hands hovering over her, terrified of what he might find. "Grandma, are you okay? Are you hurt?" She was dazed, a small cut on her cheek. But as he helped her sit up and gently examined her limbs, he realized with a staggering wave of relief that nothing was broken. She had twisted her ankle, but she could still put weight on it. They had been lucky, but the incident left him trembling, a stark reminder of how close they were to complete disaster. The fall took a toll on them both. Betty was shaken and moved even more slowly, her limp becoming more pronounced. And the physical cost of the journey was finally catching up to Tyler. The adrenaline that had fueled him for hours was beginning to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The straps of the backpack dug mercilessly into his shoulders, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. He felt a profound weariness, not just of the body but of the soul. The constant vigilance, the weight of his lies, the terror of being caught, it was all a crushing burden. He leaned against a tree, his forehead pressed against the cool, rough bark, and for a fleeting moment he thought about giving up. He could just sit down, wait for someone to find them, and let the inevitable happen. It would be so much easier than this impossible climb. But then, through the trees, he saw it, a familiar, jagged shape against the sky. It was the old lightning-scarred oak tree, a landmark he knew from his days of exploring as a younger, more carefree boy. The sight was like a jolt of electricity to his exhausted system. He knew this tree. He knew the path that led from it. He knew exactly where they were. They were close. The mental map he had been following, a fragile thing constructed from memory and hope, was accurate. He wasn't just lost in an endless wilderness. He was on a specific path to a specific destination. The knowledge cut through the fog of his exhaustion and reignited the dying ember of his resolve. He pushed himself off the tree, his body still aching, but his spirit renewed with a fresh surge of desperate purpose. He took Betty's hand and pulled her gently to her feet. The light in the forest was changing, shifting from the golden hues of late afternoon to the long, deep shadows of approaching dusk. The air grew perceptibly colder, a damp chill that seemed to emanate from the earth itself and seeped through their clothes. The change brought with it a new and more urgent kind of fear. The woods, which had felt like a sanctuary in the daylight, were transforming into a place of menace, a dark and confusing labyrinth. He knew they had to reach the mine before nightfall. To be caught in the open in the full dark was a danger he could not even bear to contemplate. The race was no longer just against the people who were looking for them, but against the setting of the sun itself, a celestial clock that was indifferent to their plight. He could smell it before he could see it. A change in the air, a faint but distinct scent of cold, damp stone, and the mineral tang of coal dust. It was the breath of the mountain, a scent he recognized from the edge of the mine's entrance. The smell grew stronger with every step, a promise that their destination was near. "We're almost there, Grandma," he whispered, his own voice hoarse and strained. "I promise. It's going to be safe and warm." He poured the last of his energy into that final push, his words a mantra against the growing darkness and the weary ache in his bones. He was pulling her more than guiding her now. His focus narrowed to the single objective of reaching that dark opening in the rock before the last of the light was gone. They stumbled out of the dense tree line and into a small rocky clearing, and there it was, the entrance to the Sullivan coal mine. It was a perfect dark square cut into the face of the mountain, a gaping maw framed by thick, rotting timbers that were grey with age and weather. A faded, rust-streaked metal sign that read, "Danger, keep out," hung crookedly from a single nail. The sight was both terrifying and beautiful, a symbol of their last, desperate hope. The profound, absolute blackness within the entrance seemed to absorb the fading light around it, promising a silence and a secrecy that no other place on earth could offer. They had done it. Against all odds, the 11-year-old boy and his frail grandmother had crossed their wilderness and reached their sanctuary. The first, most dangerous part of their journey was over. He stood at the threshold of that darkness for a long moment, the cool air from the mine washing over his face like a cold tide. He looked back one last time at the world they had fled, at the darkening sky and the distant forested hills that hid the town below. Then he looked at Betty, whose face was a mixture of weariness and confusion in the twilight. Her hand trembled in his, a small, frightened bird. This was the point of no return. Taking a shaky breath that felt like it was drawn from the very center of his being, he let go of her hand just long enough to pull his phone from his pocket. He swiped the screen, and the small, powerful beam of the flashlight cut a clean, trembling circle into the oppressive void. He took her hand again, his grip now firm and resolute. With his other hand holding the light steady, he took the first step across the threshold, leading his grandmother out of the dying light of the world and into the cold, silent heart of the mountain. The temperature dropped instantly, a sudden enveloping chill that felt a dozen degrees colder than the evening air. The sound of their footsteps, a soft shuffle on the rocky ground outside, transformed into a sharp, echoing report that seemed to travel for miles into the darkness ahead. The heavy, mineral smell of the earth was overpowering, the scent of a place that had not felt the sun or the rain for 100 years. The wooden frame of the entrance passed over their heads, and the last sliver of the outside world vanished. They were inside. They were hidden. They were utterly and completely alone. The beam from the phone's flashlight cut a trembling circle through the profound, suffocating darkness, a single point of order in a universe of chaos. The air inside the mine was immediately different, a physical presence that was degrees colder and carried the heavy ancient scent of damp stone and the ghostly memory of coal dust. The ground beneath their feet changed from soft earth to a hard, uneven floor of rock and slag, and the sound of their shuffling steps transformed into a sharp, echoing report that seemed to travel for miles into the blackness ahead. Tyler held his grandmother's hand tighter, the fragile warmth of her skin a stark contrast to the tomb-like chill that seeped into his bones. He was their guide, their protector, and the small battery-powered light he held was the only thing standing between them and an infinite, sightless void. He led her forward, deeper into the mountain's heart, his memory of the path a fragile thread he followed with intense concentration. The journey was slow, a careful navigation around fallen rocks and treacherous pools of standing water that reflected his light back in distorted, unsettling ways. The darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides, so complete that it felt like a physical weight against his skin. It swallowed the sound of their breathing and seemed to muffle the frantic beating of his own heart. He kept the light aimed just ahead of their feet, creating a small moving island of safety in the vast, silent ocean of black. He was acutely aware of every stumble, every hesitant step his grandmother took, and he murmured a constant stream of reassurances that were as much for himself as they were for her. This was the point of no return, a place from which retreat was as dangerous as moving forward. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 10 minutes, he saw the opening he was looking for. It was a darker shape within the darkness, a side chamber off the main tunnel that he had discovered weeks ago during a brief, daring exploration. He guided Betty toward it, the beam of his light sweeping across the entrance and into the space beyond. The air in this chamber was different, drier, less oppressive, and with a stillness that spoke of stability. This was it. This was the place he had gambled everything on. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. They had made it. They had reached the sanctuary he had pictured in his mind, a hidden pocket within the mountain where the world could not find them. His first priority was Betty. Her breath was coming in shallow, weary gasps, and she leaned heavily on him. His light fell upon the most incredible, impossible sight, a dusty but intact mattress lying in a corner, its surface protected by a thick sheet of clear plastic. For a moment he could only stare, his mind struggling to process the presence of such a mundane human object in this forgotten place. He led his grandmother to it, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange burgeoning hope. He helped her sit down on the edge, the old springs groaning softly under her weight. He took the thick wool blanket from his backpack and carefully draped it over her trembling shoulders. She sank into its warmth, her eyes closing, a small, exhausted sigh escaping her lips. For the first time in hours, she was resting. With Betty settled, Tyler allowed himself to take in their surroundings. He swept the flashlight beam slowly around the small chamber, his initial relief giving way to a deepening sense of awe and mystery. This was no mere cave. Against one wall, 2 old wooden crates had been stacked to form a makeshift table, and beside it stood a single sturdy chair fashioned from the same materials. The space was small, perhaps no bigger than his own bedroom, but it was arranged with a clear sense of purpose. It was a room. It was a home. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. They were not just intruders in an abandoned mine. They were guests in a space that someone else had once inhabited, a ghost who had left behind the faint but undeniable traces of their existence. His light drifted across the rough-hewn stone walls, and it was then that he saw the markings. Faintly etched into the coal dust and stone were lines, dozens of them scratched into the rock with something sharp. He moved closer, his breath catching in his throat. They were calendars, Precise rows of hash marks were grouped into sets of 7, marking the passing of weeks. Below them, entire months were tallied, a silent, desperate accounting of time spent in the dark. A profound sense of shared experience washed over him, a connection to the unknown person who had also sought refuge in this very spot. They were not the first. Someone else had survived here, had measured their life by the slow scratch of a mark on a stone wall, and that knowledge was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He turned the light back toward his grandmother, who had now curled up on her side, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of sleep. As the beam swept across the mattress, it caught the dull, unmistakable glint of metal peeking out from underneath the edge. A jolt of pure, unadulterated curiosity shot through his exhaustion. He knelt down beside the mattress, his knees pressing into the cold, dusty ground, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to wake her. He reached under the heavy fabric, his fingers brushing against something cold, hard, and rectangular. His heart began to hammer against his ribs as he slowly, carefully, pulled the object out into the circle of his light. It was a box, a metal lockbox, its surface covered in a fine layer of rust that flaked away under his touch. He held it in his lap, the cold metal seeping through the fabric of his jeans. It was heavier than it looked, filled with the dense weight of secrets. The latch was a simple metal clasp, so weakened by time and moisture that it seemed fused shut. He pressed his thumb against it, applying steady pressure. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a soft, groaning protest that sounded deafeningly loud in the profound silence of the chamber, the rusted latch gave way. The sound echoed for a fraction of a second, a metallic sigh that seemed to release a breath that had been held for decades. He paused, his own breath held tight in his chest, listening to the silence that rushed back in to fill the space. With trembling fingers, he slowly lifted the lid. The air that escaped from within was stale, carrying the faint dry scent of old paper and time itself. There, nestled against the corroded interior of the box, was a single object. It was a book, a small diary bound in what had once been dark leather, now cracked and faded with age. He lifted it out with the reverence one might reserve for a sacred artifact. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the edges slightly curled. It felt impossibly fragile in his hands, a delicate vessel containing a life he couldn't yet imagine, a story left behind in the dark heart of the mountain. He sat there for a long moment, the weight of the diary in his hands, the sleeping form of his grandmother beside him, and the immense, silent darkness all around. He took a deep, shaky breath and carefully opened the cover to the first page. His light fell upon the neat, deliberate script. The ink faded, but still perfectly legible. At the top of the page, a date was written, a time-stamp from a world that no longer existed. October 14th, 1984. A tremor went through him, a deep, resonant shock of understanding that bridged the decades in an instant. This was it. This was the moment from his arrival. The moment he now understood was not a beginning, but the discovery of one. He and his grandmother were not the first souls to seek sanctuary in this tomb, and the story he had just unearthed would change the entire course of his own. He ran a thumb over the brittle cover of the diary, the texture of the cracked leather a strange, grounding sensation in the overwhelming darkness. The air in the chamber was utterly still, the only sound the soft, rhythmic breathing of his sleeping grandmother and the faint, high-pitched hum of his own nervous system. With a deep, shaky breath that seemed to draw in the cold, ancient air of the mountain itself, he opened the book. The first page was filled with neat, deliberate cursive. The ink faded from black to a soft, ghostly brown. The date at the top, October 14th, 1984, felt like a message from another civilization. He read the first few lines, his light trembling slightly, and a name emerged from the page, Robert Sullivan, the last owner of the mine. A man who, like him, had come to this place not as an explorer, but as a refugee from a world that had crumbled around him. The diary began with the stark, unemotional language of failure. Robert chronicled the final, desperate months of the Sullivan mine, the bankruptcy that had erased his family's legacy, and the crushing weight of the town's judgment. Tyler read about the shame that followed Robert like a shadow, the way old friends would cross the street to avoid him, the palpable disappointment in the eyes of the men he could no longer employ. He wrote of his wife leaving, her departure a quiet, final closing of a door on the life they had built. Tyler felt a profound and unexpected kinship with this ghost from the past. He too knew what it was to hide, to feel the weight of circumstances you could not control, to believe that invisibility was the only form of safety left in the world. As Tyler turned the brittle pages, he followed Robert's descent into this subterranean life. The first few weeks were a litany of despair. The diary spoke of a cold so deep it felt like it was in his bones, a hunger that was a constant gnawing ache, and a loneliness so profound it was like a physical presence in the chamber with him. Robert described surviving on scavenged food from town dumpsters late at night, his face hidden under a cap, moving like a phantom through the world that had once been his. Every word resonated with Tyler's own fear, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety about their dwindling supplies and the terror of what would happen if they were ever discovered. He was reading his own heart, written in another man's hand 30 years before. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone of the entries began to shift. After months of pure survival, a new voice emerged from the pages, one of stubborn, quiet defiance. Robert wrote about the strange, unexpected peace he found in the absolute silence of the mine, a place where the world's judgment could not reach him. He began to see his refuge not as a tomb, but as a sanctuary, a place where he could strip his life down to its most essential elements and find the will to continue. He wasn't just hiding from his past anymore, he was actively surviving it, forging a new existence in the dark. Tyler looked around the small chamber, his flashlight beam tracing the outlines of the crate table and the chair, and saw them not as pathetic remnants, but as monuments to a quiet, powerful act of creation. The diary became a logbook of resilience. Robert detailed how he had found the discarded mattress and dragged it into the chamber, piece by piece. He wrote of learning the patterns of the night watchman at a nearby lumber yard, allowing him to salvage the scrap wood he used to build his furniture. These were not the actions of a man who had given up. They were the meticulous, deliberate steps of someone who was refusing to be erased. A powerful realization began to dawn on Tyler, a seed of an idea that was both terrifying and liberating. Hiding did not have to be the end of the story. It could be a chapter, a necessary pause before the next one began, a period of gathering strength in the dark before stepping back into the light. His purpose became clear in the later entries. Robert wrote of taking odd cash jobs in a neighboring county, working as a day laborer where no one knew his name or his history. He was saving money, every single dollar tucked away in the very lockbox Tyler now held. The goal was no longer just to survive the winter, it was to build a future. He was planning his own escape, not from the law or social workers, but from the ghost of his own failure. He was not a permanent resident of the dark. He was a traveler passing through on his way to somewhere else. This idea struck Tyler with the force of a physical blow, rearranging the entire landscape of his understanding. He had seen their flight as a desperate final act, but Robert's story offered another possibility, that this mine could be a bridge, not a grave. He carefully turned to the last page, his heart pounding. The entry was dated 2 years after the first, in the summer of 1986. The handwriting was different, bolder, firmer, the script of a man who had reclaimed some essential part of himself. It did not begin with a description of the day or the weather. It began with a salutation that seemed to reach across the decades and speak directly to him. "If anyone ever reads this," it started, and Tyler's breath caught in his throat. This was not just a record. It was a message, a letter left in a bottle and cast into an ocean of time, and he was the one who had found it on a distant shore. Robert wrote that he had finally saved enough. That very night, he was leaving. He had a bus ticket, a new set of clothes, and a few $1,000s that represented 2 years of relentless, anonymous work. He was heading west, to a place where the name Sullivan meant nothing, where he could start again, free from the weight of his past. He wrote that he did not know what would become of him, but for the first time in years, he felt the thrill of possibility. He was choosing to step out of the darkness and back into the world, not as the man he had been, but as the man he had become in this cold, silent chamber. Then came the words that would change everything for Tyler. "Know that hope can keep you alive in the darkest places," Robert wrote. "It is not a fire, but a single stubborn ember that you must protect with everything you have. It is the one thing they can never take from you." The words were a key, unlocking a part of Tyler's heart that he had sealed off with fear and desperation. It was permission to feel something other than terror. It was an instruction, a command from a man who had earned the right to give it, a fellow survivor who had walked this same path and found his way through. He read the last 3 words over and over, his light fixed on the page as if he could absorb their meaning through his eyes. "Do not give up." It was so simple, so direct, a final, powerful plea from the ghost of the mountain. He looked over at the sleeping form of his grandmother, her face peaceful in the dim light, and the immense weight of his responsibility felt different. It was still there, still heavy, but it was no longer the crushing burden of a lone, terrified boy. It was a shared legacy of endurance, a sacred duty passed from one survivor to another. A single, hot tear escaped his eye, tracing a clean path through the grime and coal dust on his cheek. It was followed by another, and then another, until his shoulders began to shake with silent, contained sobs. He cried for the boy who had been forced to become an adult too soon, for the grandmother lost in the fog of her own mind, and for the stranger named Robert Sullivan, who had reached through time to tell him he was not alone. In the absolute safety and secrecy of the dark, he finally allowed himself to break, to release the terror and loneliness he had held inside for so long, knowing that he was not falling into an abyss, but into the steady hands of a shared history. He gently closed the diary, the brittle pages whispering shut, and held it to his chest like a shield. The metal of the lockbox was cold against his legs, but the story inside it was a source of profound warmth. This chamber was not a tomb. It was a classroom. It was a sanctuary. It was the place where a man had reforged his soul and where a boy had just discovered his own. A new, quiet resolve settled over him, displacing the fear. He would protect the ember of his hope. He would honor the legacy of the man who had left this message for him. He made a silent promise to the darkness, to his grandmother, and to the ghost of Robert Sullivan. He would not give up. The 5 days that followed were a testament to that promise. Tyler cared for Betty with a renewed sense of purpose, his actions no longer driven by pure frantic fear, but by a steady, quiet resolve drawn directly from the pages of the diary. He rationed their food with the meticulous care of a seasoned quartermaster, making each cracker and every spoonful of beans last. He administered Betty's medicine on a strict schedule, a small ritual of order in the timeless dark. He was no longer just a fugitive hiding from the world. He was an inhabitant of this strange sanctuary, a student of survival, following the curriculum left behind by the teacher he would never meet. He was enduring, and in that endurance, he found a strength he never knew he possessed. On the 5th day, as their food supply dwindled to a single can of peaches and a few crackers, the mountain offered one last miracle. Betty woke from a nap, and as Tyler handed her a bottle of water, her eyes focused on him with a clarity that hadn't been there for months. The fog was gone. She took his small, dirt-stained hands in her own, her grip surprisingly firm. "Tyler, my love," she said, her voice clear and steady, "you are trying so hard to protect me. I know you are." A wave of shock and relief washed over him. She was here. She was with him. "But you cannot live your life in the dark for me," she continued, her eyes filling with tears. "You need a chance to be a child. You deserve the sun." As he began to cry, the tears he had held back for days finally streaming down his face, he insisted that he would never let them send her to a terrible place. She smiled, a sad, wise smile that held all the love in the world. "Then don't let them put me in a terrible one," she whispered, her voice a plea and a release all at once. "Help me find a good one." In that moment, Tyler understood. The lesson from Robert's diary was not just about enduring the darkness, but about having the courage to leave it. That afternoon, holding his grandmother's hand, he walked out of the Sullivan mine and into the blinding light of the sun, not in surrender but in an act of profound, courageous love. They walked not back to their empty trailer, but directly to Mrs. Patterson's front door. The story that unfolded over the next few hours, of a desperate flight, a hidden sanctuary, and a diary left by a ghost, moved everyone who heard it. Miss Jenkins, the social worker, was faced with a choice: to follow procedure or to follow her conscience. She chose the latter. Leveraging 20 years of experience, she saw not a problem to be processed, but a family to be helped. She made calls, pulled strings, and fought for them. She found a small, highly rated group home for Alzheimer's patients in Charleston, a place with gardens and kind nurses that allowed for regular family visits. And for Tyler, she found a placement with the Thompsons, a quiet, decent foster family in the nearby town of Beckley who understood he needed space, not saving. 3 years later, Tyler Miller is 14 years old. He is not the same boy who walked into that mine. He is taller, stronger, but the quiet intensity in his eyes remains. Every weekend he takes a bus to Charleston to visit his grandmother. Some days she knows him, her face lighting up with recognition as he walks in. On other days, she doesn't. But he is always there, holding her hand, telling her about his week, reading to her from a book. He earns good grades in school and has a part-time job at a local diner, saving every dollar he can for college. The Thompsons, a kind and patient couple, offered to adopt him last year. He politely declined, explaining that he needed to keep his family name, a quiet nod to the legacy he was determined to uphold. He still carries a single folded page from Robert Sullivan's diary in his wallet, the one with the final entry. The wisdom he found in the heart of that mountain was not a map to a hidden treasure, but a harder, more valuable truth. He learned that true strength wasn't just about building walls to protect the people you love. Sometimes it was about having the courage to ask for help in tearing them down. It was about understanding that the greatest act of love isn't always to carry the entire burden yourself, but to have the grace and the strength to allow others to help you bear its weight.